All right, welcome to the Latest.com show. Joining me from Canada, the land up north, he's a contributor to Latest.com and a staff writer at Issue Hawk, Eric Carriere from Toronto. And joining me from New York, he's a 24-year veteran of the U.S. State Department, the author of We Meant Well, and a fan favorite here at Latest, Peter Van Buren. How are you guys?
Good, you?
Doing great.
Well, that's good to hear, but unfortunately, according to Latest.com, the end of the world is upon us. According to the Christian group E-Bible Fellowship, I think the end of the world is actually happening on Eric's end right now. According to the Christian group E-Bible Fellowship, the end of the world is sometime today. The group's founder says last time God used water to flood the earth, this time he'll use fire. I got my marshmallows ready. Peter, how are you going to spend your end of the world?
Well, since this is the end of the world, so therefore, in fact, no one's going to actually see this. It'd be okay if I took my shirt off for the rest of the interview.
Pretty much everything's off limits now. We can just do whatever.
Pretty much everything's on the table. You know, it's interesting. CNN, when they first went on the air years and years ago, said that they're going to stay on the air from that moment until the end of the world. And they actually prepared a video that they, in theory, will show at the end of the world that says we're going off the air, the world is over, and thanks for watching. But I mean, who really believes that the end of the world is about that? Fooled you.
Eric, how are you spending your end of the world?
Just got back from the dog park. I mean, other than that, not too much is different today. Still working, so I guess that means that it must not actually be coming. But I mean, I think every year there's a new end of the world date. In 2012, it was supposed to be the big one with the Mayan calendar. And I think in 2013, they predicted some end of the world. And then the same group did it again this year. So, I mean, I'm sure the end of the world's next year on December 26th.
Well, can't we just call Japan or Australia and check if the world's ended over there yet?
That's true.
Right.
I think God keeps track of time using American time.
Oh, is that Eastern or Pacific?
I think God lives on the East Coast. I mean,
that makes sense.
Pretty straightforward there.
All right. Well, last week we spent a lot of time talking about gun violence and shootings and gun control, and within like 12 hours we saw another mass shooting in Oregon. Guy walks in, kills 9 people, shoots I think 18, 20 people. Peter, is there you mentioned last week that the amount of people shot here doesn't even come close to the amount of people that are killed by terrorist attacks. A day later, Obama said the same thing. You wrote about it this week. How does the amount of terrorist deaths stack up with the amount of shooting deaths in this country?
Well, basically, there's no comparison. Over the last decade or so, we've had close to 300,000 people shot. The numbers are staggering, and the number of Americans killed by terrorism here in the United States is anywhere between 0 and 30-something, depending on how you count these things. But go ahead, double the number of terrorist deaths, triple it, whatever you want to do, and you're still left with this incredible disparity between deaths that we spend billions of dollars to allegedly prevent, the terrorists, and staggering numbers of deaths that we are unable to come up with even the most basic of solutions to try to prevent. By the time this podcast comes out, who knows, there may be another mass shooting. We had 3 people shot here in New York City yesterday, which I guess isn't enough to qualify as a mass shooting.
Right. Well, you published on Latest.com. You compared it. You compared the number with X's. So the amount of 36 Americans dead compared to all of these X's representing the amount of shooting deaths in America. We've seen Obama come out say that he's gonna try to push gun control on his way out. Hillary said that she's gonna push for a gun control plan, open up manufacturers to lawsuits. Obama's talking about sensible and common sense gun control. What is sensible and common sense gun control that we can enact now? Peter?
Well, at at the end, I want to throw this to Eric and ask him what happens in Canada, where they don't seem to have these mass shootings on a regular schedule, and see how guns are handled there. But here in the United States, I think we need to look at what we can do and do what we can do, understanding that it won't be perfect. We can start with some very, very basic things. Background checks at gun shows. Right now, anyone can go into a gun show and purchase a weapon, no questions asked, no ID necessary, cash on the table, and you walk right out with an assault rifle. That has to stop. We need to think about the kinds of weapons that are available over the counter to American citizens. Military-style weapons, high-capacity magazines, automatic weapons or semi-automatic weapons that can be easily converted to automatic. Rifles that really have no useful purpose for hunting or anything else. They're only for killing people. All of that needs to be put away. We don't need any of that. Anyone who wants to hunt has plenty of options available, and anyone who thinks they need a gun to prevent a home break-in or something like that, there's plenty of simple handguns that will do all that job. I think another thing that needs to be adjusted is our laws about reporting mental health concerns. Those laws are enshrined in something called the HIPAA, which is an abbreviation that stands for a set of laws that basically prohibit the sharing of medical information. Your doctor can't call up the newspaper and tell them about your latest medical problems. However, the HIPAA has all sorts of exceptions in it for quote-unquote national security. Your doctor can, in fact, share information with the NSA when he or she feels it is necessary. Your doctor also can share information with the government when he or she feels it is necessary to protect the President of the United States or other senior government officials. Next time you're at the doctor, there's usually a HIPAA poster on the wall. Go ahead and read the exceptions. They're all written down there. So this is not a staggering thing to say that doctors should be able to report mental illnesses far and beyond waiting for someone to be declared mentally incompetent by a court, which is the standard now. Let's start with those things. Let's see where they take us and adjust fire as we go. But I'm interested in Eric's thoughts here from Canada.
Before we get to Canada, Eric, you mentioned, you wrote about the mental health issue and guns and how that should be the #1 approach. What do you suggest that, how do we tackle the mental health issue here in this country outside of what Peter just said?
Well, first off, I don't think we should villainize mental health. I think that is one of the major issues, especially with the Republicans in the media right now, is instead of trying to find a solution, they just demonize it. That's bad. That's not helping the situation at all. That makes people feel pushed out of society. What we need to do is find a way to talk to these individuals, integrate them, make them feel welcome. If they're being bullied, like in Columbine, make sure that there's some kind of outlet to help them cope with it. We don't necessarily have that at the moment, and while bullying has been cracked down on a lot in recent years, it's not good enough yet, and it's quite obvious. For other individuals that suffer from maybe a form of autism or Asperger's, like some of the other shooters have in the past, we need to find a way to check in with these individuals, and it can't just be the parents that have to do that, because a lot of the time, especially if you look at the Sandy Hook shooter, sometimes they're babied by their parents, and it's not going to show the problem that maybe occurs. Okay. So I think we need to, as a society, come up with a plan to help these individuals more often than pushing them out.
And what solutions has Canada come up in? I'm sorry, yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Peter.
2 points. First of all, as far as demonizing the mentally ill, I agree that's certainly not a solution. But what I'm talking about here is simply preventing people with certain types of mental illness from owning firearms. If they never go out and buy a gun, this information will never even come to light. It's going to sit in a database and wait for them to purchase a handgun. And simply saying, I'm sorry, you can't have a gun, it seems to me to be a number of steps away from any form of demonization. It seems very realistic. The other issue, which I strongly agree with you on, is providing options for mental health care to people who need it. Here in the United States, the health care that you have access to is directly related to how much money you have and the job that you work. The issues of the details of Obamacare aside, basically, you only get the health care that you can afford. And if you don't have full-time employment that offers benefits, and if you don't purchase some of the above the bottom level healthcare plans, which still cost money through Obamacare, your access to mental health care is limited or non-existent. And that too needs to change.
Mm-hmm.
Eric, how has Canada dealt with the gun problem? Because it seems like any Canadian can just come down here, grab a firearm. They're available readily at Walmart.
Absolutely. Well, it's funny, actually, just after this shooting occurred, I decided to rewatch Bowling for Columbine just to get a taste for the politics of it all. And now the statistics from that are a little dated, but I believe they said the gun deaths at the time of that movie, when it was filmed, were around 11,000 in the U.S. And in Canada, the number was something like 30. That's a huge discrepancy. And in terms of gun ownership, while the U.S. does own a lot more guns, it's not like Canadians don't own them either. There is a large amount of the population that does own them. I think the U.S. has 3 times as many guns when you put the numbers on the same scale. But it's not like Canada doesn't own guns. There's a lot of hunting here. But I think it's just a difference in the culture. And I don't know if, I mean, this is possibly highly generalizing it all, but I think when a violent situation occurs, the Canadians' first response isn't to pull out their gun and shoot somebody. I don't know if, I'm not trying to say that we're more friendly or we just approach situations differently, but there's definitely a difference in the culture and the way we approach violent situations.
Peter, what is it about Americans that makes us want to kill each other all the time?
You know, I wish I knew precisely, but in fact, I think at the end of the day, Eric is hitting on the fundamental problem. I mean, the solutions that I suggested that perhaps Hillary has in mind, maybe even Obama, are picking at the edges of a problem. And I voice those only because I'm not sure we can do anything other than pick at the edges. We are at our core a violent people. And I think there's a number of things that cause that, and I'm not sure how many of them can be fixed or corrected or worked on. Number one, at least for the last decade and a half, the United States government has signaled to Americans and to the world that the only solution to large-scale problems is violence. We've got a terrorist problem, we better blow up a few countries in hopes of getting a couple of terrorists. In Yemen, for example, to kill 17 terrorists, we actually killed 243 people along the way. Inside the United States, our solution to limited law enforcement problems has been to militarize our police, to equip them with weapons of war, literally with tanks, and to allow them to use weapons such as tasers and gas and the like to enforce some kind of vigilante justice almost. These are very clear messages that violence is an acceptable way to resolve problems, and I think they get into Americans' heads. At the same time, we live in a culture of violence. I mean, from our very first days, we're watching movies and television that tell us violence is an acceptable thing. Other countries obviously see these same movies and cartoons, but you put it all together and it leads in a particular direction. I mean, last night I was flipping through the channels and I get 3 military type channels, one of which had essentially pornography about sniper rifles. And it was full of people in there talking about how we can take down them at this distance or that distance, and guys hitting targets and somebody else saying, good kill, good kill. Each of these is a tiny piece of the puzzle, but when you pull back, the mosaic sends a singular message. And I think we see that message acted out on our streets all too often.
Well, that's absolutely true, but I mean...
What's odd about it is that...
Go ahead, Eric.
I'm sorry. Well, I was going to say, what's odd about it all, though, is that if I was to compare the culture between the U.S. and Canada in terms of pop culture and everything, there isn't much of a difference. Everything here is the same. That notion that Canadians are more welcoming and friendly isn't always the truth, and quite frankly, the two types of people between our two countries are more or less the same. We're consumeristic, we love our pop culture, and we eat the same food. Everything about us is more or less the same, except this one issue of guns for some reason.
Well, I mean, just to touch on Peter's point about this being part of the culture, you know, even if you impose all these gun control laws, you create a background check system, you do all the things that Hillary wants to do with, you know, you put manufacturers on trial, basically, as responsible for deaths. Look at the stories that we have on Latest.com this week. You have an 11-year-old shot his 12-year-old brother in the head accidentally. You have an 11-year-old shot an 8-year-old girl in the head on purpose. You know, these aren't guns that kids are going and buying and not, you know, at gun shows. At some point, don't we need to take people's guns away if we really want to affect the real root of the problem, Peter?
I don't remember. Oh,
Go ahead, Eric.
okay. Well, I don't remember what year it was, but I do know in Australia, was it either the 80s or 90s, they did a gun buyback program where they bought, I think the statistic was about 600,000 guns, and it worked quite well. The rates dropped, and their gun issues kind of evaporated compared to what they were before.
So just a voluntary gun buyback program, you think, would affect the number of guns in this country dramatically? Because we do have over 300 million guns in this country, and I just saw a report today that the gun sales just hit a new record this past month. So it's only getting worse. Peter?
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about a lot of things. I mean, a gun buyback program couldn't hurt. In the United States, let's get the sports teams, the NFL, together and say they're going to give out decent tickets in return for people turning guns in, something like that. Let these organizations do a little work for the society. But I think that with kids with guns, there's a couple of things that come to mind. First would be the idea of some kind of mandatory training, safety training that is required before you can buy a gun. Certainly, you've got to take training like that before you can drive a car. You've got to go through certain classes in order to be a food manager. You've got to get a license to be a barber in the United States. So some kind of minimal safety training doesn't seem like a bad idea. In addition, I think parents need to be held responsible for the way they store their guns and what happens when their children do these things with their guns. I think those are circumstances where it makes complete sense to impose a punishment, if you will, if not a protective type order, that basically says you, the parent, are irresponsible and you can't be trusted to have firearms in your house. End of story. We're taking it away. We suspend drunk driver's licenses. I don't know why we can't enforce something on parents who put inadvertently or through their clumsiness or laziness deadly weapons in the hands of kids.
Yeah. Well, to touch on a related point, Eric wrote about it yesterday. How do you guys feel about the media naming, and us for that matter, naming the Oregon shooter or just mass shooters in general? Do you think that gives them what they want and the media should just avoid saying their name? And I mean, certainly they should avoid reading their manifestos out loud in the media. But what about just the name? Should we just avoid even naming them because they were looking for that publicity? Peter?
Well, I'll be honest.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think it's impractical to begin with. I mean, not only because of our freedoms of the press, the public need to know, and just because of the plethora of media out there, it's just simply impossible to control. I think there is a reason to ask the media to be responsible in the way that they do handle this information. For example, most media does withhold the names of victims of sexual assault voluntarily. And I don't think there's really been any widespread sense that that is infringing on our rights to a free press or the rights of the public to know what's going on. We withhold the names of most underage violators of law. So we could ask the media certainly to exercise more discretion, particularly, as you said, in terms of releasing manifestos or making public the crazy stuff that people put on Facebook. I think it's fine if the media want to say, look, the shooter's name was Peter Van Buren. He lived in Oregon. That's really enough to kind of close the news loop, if you will.
Eric, what is the problem with the media naming the shooter?
Well, I'll say personally, and I mean, it doesn't speak for much, but I actually haven't named the shooter yet, and I won't. I think in the case of the most recent Oregon shooting, especially, it was very irresponsible. I posted in the article I wrote last night, there's a clip from CNN right as the event happened, where this reporter, obviously pushed by her editors and producers, but she reads out his quote word for word, names him, when the quote itself is saying, the more people I kill, I'm going to be in the spotlight. And the way she reads it off without even showing any emotion shows just how clueless she is as she's doing this. I mean, is it the media's responsibility to name these individuals? That's up to them. But I think in a case like the most recent shooting where the shooter explicitly makes it known that he wants that, maybe it's our responsibility not to report it fully. Just saying the Oregon shooter, everybody is going to know who it is. Not naming him, does it make a difference in the end? Maybe not, but take the moral ground in that one, I suppose.
But isn't that kind of select? I mean, yeah, okay, the guy wrote that exact line, but I mean, ISIS wants to, be gruesome just so we name them and talk about their cause. How is that any different? Or any murderer for that matter? Is there really a big difference between a murderer we named that shot 4 people in Chicago or one who had written some stuff online? And, why should we name all criminals except mass shooters?
No, I'm not just saying that, but in the case of if we're trying to solve a problem at home, i.e. the mass shootings, we have to start at home. We can't fix every problem at once. ISIS, of course, is going to exist for as long as it needs to, and it's going to terrorize people. But if we're trying to fix one small problem at home, which is these school shootings, which seem to occur almost every 6 months or per year, let's start with a small change. It's not much, but it is a small step towards some kind of progression.
All right. Well, as Peter touched on before, we don't just kill each other. America kills a lot of other people too. So this week, the U.S. military bombed the Doctors Without Borders hospital in Afghanistan. The Doctors Without Borders / MSF, as they're known in France, they say that the U.S. is guilty of war crimes. The U.S. says it was an accident. Peter, I mean, is this an accident or a war crime, or can you have both?
It's disingenuous of the United States every time something happens like this to claim it's an accident. Let's start with the mechanics, the physical, technical details of how this hospital was destroyed. I've had the opportunity to talk with a retired Air Force Special Operations officer. And for what he told me and for what I'm able to be learning through my own research, basically you had an American Special Forces operator on the ground designating this hospital as a target. There's a number of methods and techniques that could have been used to do that, but one of them was. The hospital was destroyed by an AC-130, which was it's a gunship, it's an airplane that was flying overhead, and it is considered what is known as a first strike or first hit weapon, not because it's used first, but because with its technology and the fact that it's flying in a very slow circle, it will hit the place it is designated to hit on the first shot. So to begin with, there's no question that the United States was shooting at this hospital and it hit the target it intended to hit. The next question, of course, is whether there was any legitimate reason to shoot at a hospital. Some of the early reports said there were Taliban fighters in there or whatever. And the answer to that is no. Hospitals are protected under all sorts of international law, as well as just sort of basic humanity, if you will. You don't blow them up, you don't bomb them. It's simply not the case. And in fact, in this instance, we now know that there were no Taliban fighters inside, and Doctors Without Borders goes out of their way to make sure things like that don't happen. So the only thing that's really left in the unknown here is whether the Afghans said to the Special Forces operator, let's shoot that hospital, or whether the Special Forces operator on his own said, let's shoot that hospital. At that point, calling it an accident, calling it a mistake, starts to get pretty hard to buy into. If the United States was truly certain this was an accident or a mistake, then you'd think that they would be willing to allow an independent international body to conduct the investigation. But America says that isn't going to happen.
This is the first time that the U.S. has actually hit, first of all, it's a non-profit, a very respected one. It's doctors who, go to the most dangerous parts of the world for no pay and help the most needy people. And it's, a European organization. For years now, we've accepted collateral damage in Iraq and Yemen with all these airstrikes. Is this the point where something might change about how we look at potential collateral damage or how we evaluate airstrikes, since the massive amount of Islamic casualties all over those countries have not affected that at all? Peter?
Well, first of all, it's clearly not the first time the United States has blown up a hospital. We blew up and/or attacked 3 separate hospitals in Iraq in 2003, and a number of smaller clinics. We blew up a hospital in former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, and we blew up the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in that same time period, which, while not a hospital, was clearly a protected under international law facility. There's been a lot of smaller strikes against clinics and wedding parties and what have you, stuff that should be off bounds in any kind of war. If you want to extend that to America's allies who use America's weapons to do this, we can get into the hospitals and schools that the Israelis targeted in Gaza over a number of occasions. We can get into what the Saudis are doing right now, dropping American cluster munitions into urban areas in Yemen. I think that the United States has decided that this type of thing is essentially policy. If you want to decide that some of these facilities were targeted on purpose, that's fine. If you want to say they were all accidents, well, it doesn't really change things. As long as the United States continues to use these horrific weapons in confined areas, you're going to have these things happen. And America seems to have washed its hands of this and basically said, well, this is how we make war, and this is what's going to happen. And to you brown people out there, to hell with all of you.
Well, you know, I think that the media has treated this a little bit differently, looking at it a little more specifically. Eric, do you think the world is changing its views on how we deal with these things so that we might have to change how we deal with these things?
The world can change its view as much as it wants, but who's really going to police the United States? Nobody can step in there and tell them what to do. I mean, the U.S. has been doing or performing an interventionist policy since really the dawn of the Cold War, and even a little bit before that. Nobody's ever going to change that. Who's the superpower that'll step in? People might say Russia, and people may say China, but neither of those powers will really go beyond their sphere of influence because they have no interest in doing so. Russia's already starting to ramp up its foreign policy, pushing into Syria now, and China's always been... Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, I was just trying to hear the outcry from the EU or NATO or any of the other international organizations that have troops on the ground in Afghanistan. I couldn't pick it up. Sorry, Eric.
Well, let's be honest, too. The UN is pretty much a useless organization. While it has great ideals, unless the US, China, and Russia want something, nothing happens. And that's the way it's always been with whatever superpowers have been in charge with the UN. Nobody will ever be able to stop the US from initiating its own foreign policy.
Well, along with the airstrike, the MSF issued a statement today regarding the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was signed by all parties and will now be ratified by Congress, presumably. You know, this is a huge deal. This is a trade deal that regulates 40% of the world economy, and yet the entire negotiation process has been in secret. Even now, we don't really know much about it. You know, will this change? I'm sorry, I just went off. How has it been so secret, and why can't we know about a trade deal that will impact almost half of the world economy? Eric?
I'll let Peter have this one.
All right.
Sorry, I'm just having something go on.
Well, I mean, that, in fact, Igor, is the question. Why can't we know? Why, and I'll just speak from the American perspective, but I think it applies to every country that is signing on to the TPP or planning to sign on. Why can't we know? Why are the negotiations secret? Why are the terms of the agreement secret? Why can't we know? We've already learned that the details have been leaked to some American companies. Their input has been sought, particularly on certain issues like intellectual property rights. That's a big part of what the U.S. wants and hopefully thinks it's going to get out of the TPP. There's been conversations with Hollywood, there's been conversations with pharmaceutical manufacturers, all of whom are very concerned about intellectual property rights around the world, but no conversations with the American public. Members of Congress have not seen the full text of the TPP, and so the American people have no ability to interact with their elected representatives and say, hey, I don't agree with that, or hey, I need more information about that. This is simply something that's going to be dropped in our laps one day, and we are going to simply be told to suck it up if A is worse than B, or things have changed in ways that are detrimental to us or detrimental to the broader United States. We had to have a fight in America simply to get permission, if you will, from the White House for our Congress to even debate, discuss, and vote on the TPP. Originally, our White House said, no, we're just going to sign this ourselves, and you guys will hear about it whenever we choose to release the information to the media. It represents an imperialist view of government that should be antithetical to the United States, but unfortunately, it isn't.
Sorry, I'm good now. My headset was acting up, but I think the problem with the TPP too is that it shows how strong of a grasp corporations have on the economy and on the government. That's such a large deal that impacts pretty much a lot of the major countries in the world in such a way that the public can't even know. I think that it's disgraceful and quite disgusting. I mean, when you look at something like NAFTA between Canada and the US, for the most part, it's a deal that works both ways, and the public was generally accepting of it. But the secrecy behind the TPP is alarming.
It's interesting because we do know some things about the TPP, but what's interesting is the groups that are supporting it and are against it. So on one side, you have congressional Republicans, you have huge corporations, and somehow President Obama. And on the other hand, you have trade unions, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and somehow the Tea Party. Peter, what is it about this trade deal that has caused Obama to go so far to the corporate Republican right, while the extreme left and the extreme right are partnered against this?
It's mostly money. I think that these, first of all, just to go back, anything that large corporations are in favor of, it's very difficult for me to imagine that being anything good for me. They haven't really paid off for me in general. So there's kind of a knee-jerk sense that this is probably going to catch me and bite me in the ass. But that said, I think what we're talking about here is extraordinary amounts of money. This is what fuels our political cycle in the United States. And Obama and many of the people who support the TPP have benefited from those donations in great amounts. We know from some other countries reporting, I listened and watched the Japanese news, and they do extensive reporting on the TPP. This is a major headline item there. And there's all sorts of reports about carve-outs for certain agricultural products and special little deals that favor the Japanese automakers and things like this that suggest strongly that there's lots and lots of little bits and pieces inside the TPP that benefit certain industries, benefit certain niches over others. And I suspect that has a lot to do with the way the money flows into Washington, and has a lot to do with who's supporting this and who is standing on the sidelines a little bit.
Well, MSF said that they're worried that this will impact the worst. The worst impact will be on the most needy people that need medicine, that patents will stop this from getting generic medicine to them, and they'll have to, they'll jack up the prices like a pharma bro here in the U.S., and they just won't be able to get life-saving medication. Who else does this hurt the most? Peter?
Well, that's what we don't know. We don't know who's going to be hurt because we don't know where the hurt's going to be coming from. I think the idea that big pharma in the United States is going to be raking in money out of TPP is kind of a given, but again, the details are unclear. We already are extorted in terms of prices for pharmaceuticals here in the United States, as well as the way these things are regulated. In other places, other parts of the world, you either have some form of national health care, such as in Canada, Britain, Japan, places that are economically not dissimilar from the United States, where they've managed to make universal health care available. No system is perfect, and certainly ours is not, yada, yada, yada. But I've used the national healthcare system in Japan for my family. I've used it in Britain for myself and my family, and it served our needs just fine. It's also a lot cheaper to purchase drugs overseas. When I was doing my traveling with the State Department, I was able to find drugs that you normally take, high blood pressure medicine, that kind of thing. Prescription drugs that in the United States cost me a fortune and required me to make doctor visits, just for sale in pharmacies overseas. Same medicine, same stuff, but at a third of the cost, or maybe even less. There's got to be reasons why that is, and I just am fearful that there's stuff inside the TPP that will raise the prices here, and as Doctors Without Borders have claimed, overseas as well.
Well, speaking of Canada and drugs, Stephen Harper, the Prime Minister, has come out for the TPP. He's also come out against marijuana. Earlier this week, he said that marijuana was infinitely worse than tobacco. Eric, you're represented by this man. Do you agree with him that marijuana is infinitely worse than tobacco?
Absolutely not. Without disclosing what side of it I'm on, I believe that just looking at what's in tobacco, the answer should be plainly evident. Also, if you want to compare it even further, let's compare marijuana to alcohol. Alcohol is far more destructive on your system than marijuana ever can be. There's never been a single death related to marijuana overdose in the history of the planet. Check it, it's actually a fact. Alcohol leads to violent behavior when you drink a lot. I've never seen a stoner that's aggressive and beating people. They're usually hungry or just laughing like crazy. I think this is a case of a conservative government that needs to come out strong against marijuana out of fear that the partisan politics will take over and they'll lose votes because the right wing will get scared that they're getting soft on what they have for many years viewed as a dangerous and bad drug. It's reflective of our society and how we demonize things that don't need to be demonized.
Well, we're kind of used to this crap in the U.S., but I thought Canada was like the progressive North American country. I mean, I saw a stat. You guys are have one of the highest usages of marijuana in the world. Why is your prime minister in the middle of an election pushing this junk science? Who is he trying to appeal to?
He's just pandering to that conservative vote. Because with Justin Trudeau, the leader of the Liberals, there was a whole controversy where he smoked a joint, and so the media picked up on it, and there was an attack ad that was, a middle-aged 40-year-old mom saying, Justin Trudeau smoked a joint when he was younger. I don't want my children to be around marijuana. I won't vote for Justin. And then, it was the ad sponsored by the Conservative Party of Canada. So it's just so reflective of the two sides and how they take their stances on it. Does Harper actually believe that marijuana is infinitely worse than tobacco? Of course not, but he has to say that in the media, just like the Republicans have to be strong on certain things in the media for their towards their voters.
Peter, we live in a pretty liberal city here in New York, but yet marijuana remains not even medically legal. I mean, to a very small extent, medically available. Why haven't we come around on this?
Well, some states, of course, have, and it's in Oregon, Colorado, I think Washington State maybe, and other states have essentially legalized marijuana under the very, very thin cover of claiming you need a doctor saying it's for some kind of medical reason. California is a perfect example. Pretty much anybody can go to any doctor and get a legal marijuana card. And it's important to note that in none of those states has chaos broken out. The zombie apocalypse has not occurred. I'll take a risk and say the end of the world didn't happen. And in fact, in Colorado, they've raised so much money through taxes that they're actually talking about some kind of tax rebate this year. And people just seem to be kind of, forgive me, mellow about the whole thing. But yet, in the United States, as Eric was saying, in Canada, we have to demonize something in order to energize voters, because we seem to attract voters based on what they hate and oppose as opposed to what they actually support. Many of the politicians in the United States are still old enough that marijuana was not something they have any personal experience with, and they grew up in an environment where they were told as kids that marijuana was, some kind of evil gateway drug to heroin and all the crazy stuff that went on there. Even politicians like Obama and things are still, who have smoked marijuana, are still beholden to a number of people who are old enough that they're still frightened of this, and so they have to toe the line and give people something to be afraid of, and that is marijuana. We ignore, as Eric pointed out, the ridiculous health care costs in the United States of tobacco and alcohol, people who die and get diseases, and we certainly avoid the law enforcement problems that alcohol brings out. It's not uncommon to see fights in bars. Driving while drunk takes who knows how many lives here in the United States, and yet we really make only kind of the very lightest attempts to regulate those drugs, while marijuana remains the great boogeyman.
And I find it extremely sad whenever an individual, as let's say a 19-year-old or 20-year-old, gets busted with marijuana. They have their entire life ruined with this drug charge on their record. Yet maybe they get off with a DUI with a slap on the wrist, depending, who they are, of course. But it's sad that can happen at all, because, and I'm not saying that you can't get intoxicated while smoking marijuana to the point where you could crash your car. Yes, absolutely you can. That's a fact. But on average, smoking marijuana and let's say the equivalent level of drinking alcohol, the effects of alcohol are going to be a lot more intense and could lead to potentially more dangerous behavior.
All right.
We get it even stupider here in the United States because of the difference between state laws and federal law. So, for example, as we said, marijuana is fully legal in Colorado. You can go to a store and actually just buy it and use it responsibly. But if you apply for a job with the federal government, you will fail your urine test and be prohibited for working for the federal government because it's very obvious that you have used marijuana. The fact that it was completely legal is irrelevant as far as the government is concerned. And that just adds yet another layer of stupidity to the entire process of how we look at certain drugs in the United States.
Absolutely, it just complicates it. And another thing to touch on too is the whole medical marijuana thing. If the country is scared to legalize it recreationally, that's fine, that's understandable. But at least pass it across the country on a medical level, because there are several treatments, and I'm not talking about the people that have glaucoma and they get marijuana just to treat that, but let's talk about the children that suffer from the intense seizures that take the cannabinoid oil and allow themselves to live a normal life again because they're no longer having 12 seizures a day. Anybody who stands against that and tries to claim that this is somehow hurting our children, I don't think they truly understand what they're talking about, and I question how much they check the facts because, quite frankly, it's pretty evident.
Another area where medical marijuana has proven to be extremely helpful is in the treatment of PTSD. We're all about our veterans here in the United States and supporting our troops. But when it comes to medically providing a substance that has clear, proven value in treating PTSD, it suddenly becomes a big boogeyman. I've talked to veterans who have been receiving care and have been told quietly by their doctors that, hey, I can't find a way to legally get you marijuana, but if you had a way to find some, you may want to give it a try and see what effect it's going to have on your PTSD. An awful lot of your buddies have benefited from that. I think we need to be a little less hypocritical.
And touching on that, for these same veterans that are suffering from PTSD, they're probably pumping them full of much harsher drugs that are having deeper effects on their brain that are highly addictive.
Absolutely.
As well as the number of them who are self-medicating with alcohol, sometimes to the point of literally drinking themselves to death, when there may be much more benign forms of medication, if you will, available to them, including marijuana. The thing that's also important, and Eric, you touched on it earlier, is that marijuana affects people's brains very differently than alcohol. I'm not a scientist, but from what I've been able to understand, and certainly what anybody who's used both drugs will tell you, is that marijuana does not create the sense of aggressiveness that is part and parcel to alcohol use. It's simply the way these drugs affect people. And so you don't hear stories about people getting high on marijuana and then putting a gun in their mouth the way you do people who get drunk first and then take their own lives. I think that may have something to do with the fact that they're very... Pardon?
I said they're putting a donut in their mouth instead.
Yeah, they're eating Doritos. I mean, it may have something to do also with the, the very low incidence of drunk driving, of marijuana being a factor in car accidents and drunk driving. People get drunk and say, oh, I can drive, I'm going to get in the car and drive really fast. Whereas, again, people who use marijuana responsibly probably are asleep on the floor at that time.
Yeah.
Well, and you were touching on the topic of the psychological effects of marijuana. Marijuana is a drug that's been highly engineered to have different effects now. So with all the different strains that are out today, we've been able to create different effects. So in the case of the oils for the kids with seizures, they've completely removed the psychoactive ingredients. It's just purely something to treat the seizures. And yet we have conservative politicians droning on about how these kids are getting high and that they're going to turn into be bad children because they're stoned all the time. But that's not really what's happening.
You touch on another important point there, the ability to manipulate these things. I mean, it's basic genetics. Marijuana is a plant. We've been manipulating the qualities of plants since, the 17th century. However, because marijuana is a illegal drug as far as the federal government is concerned, no federal money is available for research into this kind of genetic manipulation of marijuana. And many people who could get money from private organizations are afraid to because they're getting funded on other federal programs that they don't want to lose that. In Colorado, where for scientific purposes, I actually went into a marijuana store, the growers there have done a lot of experimenting on their own, basically using themselves as guinea pigs, if you will. And you can, in fact, have a discussion with the proprietor about the type of effects that you are comfortable with or looking for, including very mild effects that are really kind of well separated from what we consider a state of being high, that they can recommend to people who suffer from pain or chronic illnesses or things like that. You can get marijuana there in tablet form that is such that, as you pointed out with the cannabis oil, it does some good things without actually making you high, if that's what you intend. That research is cut off by the fact that we still keep imagining this drug is going to destroy human society as we know it.
Well, I think too, wasn't it the head of the DEA a couple months back? He made a quote saying that marijuana was as deadly as cocaine or was it heroin? He made some ridiculous comparison, and it's sad that the head of the DEA, somebody who has a lot of power, still thinks like that.
I don't know he even thinks like that, but I mean, he certainly feels it's advantageous to publicly speak like that. And that, in a way, is sad. I mean, if anybody has access to more up-to-date research, it'd be a guy like him. And for him to keep lying about that to the public seems to be completely irresponsible.
I feel like all the issues we talk about, whether it's gun control, whether it's marijuana, could be fixed if people were a little more involved and elected people that better represented them. And that brings me to the Senate candidate from Florida, a libertarian candidate admitted to dismembering a goat and drinking its blood in a pagan religious ceremony. Eric, isn't this the perfect candidate for Florida? Who better to represent the great state of Florida?
I think it's great for Florida, and it shows that, I guess, the United States, as they say, is an acceptive community for all religions. Of course, unless you're anything but Christianity.
Peter?
I'll take the joke, Igor. I mean, you want to talk about somebody who who is, one with his people. I think this guy nails it. I mean, he's an absolute nutcase, and there he is representing people in Florida. I mean, I don't know if everyone listening has read the article and is fully aware of how insane this guy really is. But he actually legally changed his name to fit with his own sort of made-up philosophy that seems to be kind of a tangle of libertarian ideas and evangelical Christian ideas and I don't know, stuff he read on a cereal box. And he changed his name to be Augustus something in line with that.
Augustus Saul Invictus.
Right. He's named himself after that watch company. And he actually drank this blood in the process of a spiritual quest where this guy walked from Florida to the Mojave Desert, which is what, roughly 4,000 miles? And then when he got out there, it was at that point that he slaughtered the goat and drank its blood for reasons that are entirely unclear. And then I guess he probably flew back to Florida. We're not sure how he actually returned there. And this guy is sitting in an elected position. He's in some form of government. Is he a state representative, or is he actually in Washington in Congress?
I believe he's no. He's a libertarian running for Florida Senate in this coming election.
Okay, so he's not actually elected to anything yet.
But I'm saying, how perfect would that be to represent that state?
Yeah. Well, so we need to start a GoFundMe immediately in favor of all of his opponents. And we might as well kick in and pay off Kim Davis not to make that porno at the same time.
Speaking of the Kim,
like a generic latest
porn company named the Dog Fart Network. That's what Peter's talking about. Offered Kim Davis $500,000 to do an interracial lesbian porn scene. Peter, how much would you pay her not to do it?
You know, I would give a kidney if necessary to stop this kind of atrocity, because you know, I don't watch a lot of porn, and I know as readers of Latest.com understand, most of my work there is extremely serious, and I rarely get into stories about giant penises or things like that. But the point being that it's like two girls in one cup a few years back, if anyone remembers that. I mean, once this gets into the wild, you simply can't stop finding it places. I mean, the Kim Davis lesbian scene will be right out there with Nail and Palin and all this other stuff that somehow finds its way into my life, and my, you know, I'm never going to be the same because of it.
How much would I have to pay you to partake in it, Peter?
Well, that's a different question, because I do have a sense of humor, and I'm very curious. You know, they make the joke about the carpet matching the drapes, and you really have to wonder with Kim's hairstyle, you know, what the carpet looks like. Thank you for the visual.
Peter, you mentioned an interesting point about Nail and Palin and those porn parodies. You know, we grew up with like SNL and TV parodies. Is porn the new satire of our generation?
Again, I'm just speaking theoretically here, but I'll say no, because, you know, there's always been this sort of subgenre of porn where they try to do, you know, parodies of Star Trek or parodies of TV shows and stuff like that, where, you know, the actors and actresses will put on red-haired wigs and claim to be characters from Family Guy or something silly like that. And I don't know that those have always been as successful. I suspect when people wish to watch porn, they really want to watch porn. If they want to watch satire, there's satire. If they want to watch Family Guy, they can watch Family Guy. I suspect when it's time to dig into that stuff, you just really want to see what you came to see.
I want to talk about one more thing before you wrap this up. It caused quite a bit of outrage on Twitter. People, the Yelp for Humans will let you review pretty much everyone you know on Facebook. A lot of people say that, you know, this will ruin lives because people on the internet are, you know, pretty awful to each other generally. Eric, will this ruin lives, or is there actually a potential positive benefit that can come from the app?
I don't really see how it's relevant at all because, well, Yelp already is known as sorry, my headset just snagged, is known as an organization that bullies businesses into paying them to not give them negative reviews. I think people will go the same way. It's a subjective thing. I might hate you, Peter, but maybe Igor loves you, or maybe Kim Davis loves you. We don't know, right? But people are always going to have people they love and people they hate. And I think when you bring an app like this into the mix, it's not going to give an accurate representation of people. And then how will you stop trolls who just log on and bash everyone? I don't think it's going to be a relevant app. I don't think it'll take off at all.
Peter?
I mean, I watch what the Latest.com readers say about us in their comments. I can only imagine if this app was opened up to them, what kind of havoc would result. I mean, it's bad enough when they troll me on Tinder, you know, to actually open this app people up to them. I think it could get pretty nasty. I mean, I wouldn't want to talk, you know, mass shooting level nasty, but certainly I would be forced to retaliate by exposing my Kim Davis fan fiction collection as a series of articles on Latest.com.
Peter, how much would it cost to get a tattoo of Kim Davis' face on your right buttocks?
Another tattoo?
Yeah, second one.
Oh, okay.
How much?
Well, the first one I got for free. The guy had a bit of a sense of humor. I suspect the second one, if there's not really room there, given the Sarah Palin image that I had up, but I would say I would do it for roughly half of what I get paid to work here at Latest.com.
$1. All right.
All right.
So you get $2 a pop.
Yeah, Eric is the highest paid of the writers. On that note, I'd like to wrap this up. See you guys next week. Peter, Eric, thank you so much for joining me. Latest.com readers, keep reading our sweatshop-produced articles. We'll see you next week.